Today on the bench we have a Matco MT2112 3/8 drive air impact. The customer said that the reverse button is broken and it has low power. Let's take it apart and see what we can find. First, we remove the body screws. There's these 4 screws on the back side of the housing. They're full of gunk and some buildup, so I use a pick to clean that out and see what we got. And these are T15 Torx screws. So we're going to clean the gunk out of the rest of them. And there is some significant buildup. And this is typical of what I see in air impacts. They're not tools that are typically well maintained by your average mechanic. So it's common to see a buildup of grease and dirt and grime. The maintenance on these isn't difficult, but like everything else in a mechanic's life, the more time he takes from repairing cars and working on his paid gig, the more he's taken away from his income. So it's not surprising that he doesn't have all the time in the world to devote to maintaining his tools. Even though these are the things that earn him money, it's still something that it's easier for him to go to a guy like me and say, hey, can you take care of it for me and get it right back to me? Because they usually have backups of these. So this may or may not be his primary one. He certainly has a second one that you can use in the meantime. Now that the screws are out, you can see how the hammer housing here is separate from the rotor housing. When this separates, a good suggestion is to keep this on a horizontal surface so that when you pull these apart, you don't have the hammer assembly in here falling out or the rotor assembly in here falling out. It's difficult to keep track of everything if you have stuff falling all over the place. So this way, it's much easier to track what's going on. So once they're separated, note that there's a gasket that goes between the hammer housing and the rotor housing here. So we're going to pull that off. And it's worth taking a look to see if this has to go on in a particular way. Usually they do. And you can tell by looking at the hammer housing to see if there's a notch cut out anywhere or if there is a tab somewhere on this gasket. And there is a tab here. I don't see an indicator on the rotor housing where that is supposed to go. So we're just going to keep that in mind when we reassemble this to see how it goes back together again, because usually this matters. And the reason it matters is because you have notches here that accept the body screws, and 2 of these are closer together than the other 2. So the orientation on here is going to be critical. We'll just keep that in mind when we put it back together again. Now that the rotor housing and the hammer housing are separate, we're going to remove the hammer assembly. This just drops out of the hammer housing here in one assembly. While this is out, I like to take a look on the inside to see if there's any metal filings or if there's any signs of excessive wear. There does not seem to be. It looks like it's in pretty good shape. You will always see a buildup of old grease and lubricant in here. That's normal. It's usually kind of gritty. It certainly is going to be burned up and harder than you'd like to see it, because although you can put grease in using this Zerk on the bottom of the housing, most mechanics don't. So the lubricant that's in here is usually the lubricant that has stayed in here since the last time this was serviced, or if it was never serviced, that's original. And this is a pretty old unit. So the one thing we're going to want to do as we go through this whole thing is check for wear and damage if any of the old lubricant is to blame for any problems. It seems like the inside of this housing is fine. The hammer assembly is kept together by these 2 pins here, and they just drop out. So using a pocket screwdriver, gonna drop the pins out. First, just pull the hammer out, and that just twists out these two dogs here. Have to be jiggled around to get them past the hammers. But once they come out here, just give that a quick look to see if there's any damage on the dogs. That looks like it's in really good shape. And then push the pins out with a pocket screwdriver. And then the hammers are now free of the hammer cage. And when you take these out, note the orientation. So they came out like this, and this is important because one has to face one way and the other faces the other way. One has this large slot on it, and this has a thinner slot, and the same size slots are on the other side. So you have to make sure that the opposite size slot is lined up, or you can also look at the orientation of the inside of the hammer. I like to say that it looks like a little ghost, where you have this guy here and his hands are facing up. One of the hammers has the ghost hands facing up. The other hammer has the ghost hands facing down, and these have to overlap. So just keep a note of that, because it's going to matter when we put it back together again. And while these are out, look for any damage. These also look like they're very good. The hammer cage also looks like it's undamaged. Check the spline drive here to see if any splines are missing or chewed up. Check the inside surfaces of the cage to see if there's any gouging or wear in there, and there isn't. You're generally not going to see any signs of wear on the pins, but it's worth checking those out as well. The rotor on these should just fall right out, and it does. Here is a cap here that goes over the front of the rotor housing. That just pulls off. There is a press fit bearing that goes in the front of this cap. That's right here. And that bearing, sometimes it falls right out, sometimes it doesn't. It really depends on the condition of everything. I just go in there with a pick and try to gain access to the seam where the bearing meets the shoulder of the cap. And this one is coming out very easily, so I just work it around a little bit. And then that finally pushes out. That feels pretty good. And then you have the cap all by itself now. This is the speed selector switch. That pulls right off because behind this is a snap ring that retains the rotor in the housing. Just get a pair of pliers and pull the selector switch off. And there you can see the external snap ring around an unshielded or unsealed bearing. So use a pair of snap ring pliers to pull that off. And be very careful. This is a small snap ring. It's easy to lose. If you do lose it, then you're going to have a heck of a time getting another one. Make sure you know where this is at all times. I put all my parts in a bag, and that bag goes inside of a box, so it's very difficult for me to lose these. Now that clip is off, the rotor pulls straight out of the housing, and in the rotor are these 6 rotor blades or vanes. They just fall right out. Once we clean this off, we'll inspect the surface better, but right now it has a lot of old lubricant on it, so that's going to have to be cleaned up. It's very gummy as well. Again, that's normal for something that's been used a lot and never really maintained. So we'll clean that up, we'll inspect the surface, and see how well that's doing. And this is the rotor housing. There is a bearing back there. We'll see if we can pull that out too. Sometimes that's a very, very tight fit, but we'll see if this lets us pull it out. And it does, easy enough. I like the fact that this isn't shielded or sealed because we'll clean that up and re-lubricate it. Just be careful that you keep the race together so you don't lose any of the ball bearings in there. And here's the empty rotor housing. Next, we have to remove the air inlet assembly. There's two slots in the handle. One's here, and one is on the other side, under the dirt there. And there's a spring clip that sets into that slot, and you have to depress that clip, push it down a little bit, and then we'll pull the entire inlet assembly out. And you can see the ears on the spring clips is what I was pushing down here. One ear's there, one ear is there. And when you push them, you got to push there and just push it down toward the bottom of the handle a little bit, just so the clip catches on the inside of the handle so you can pull the whole thing out. And then that spring clip pops off. And what we're left with then is the rest of the assembly. Unless there's a problem with the valve here, there's not a reason to disassemble this any further. If the valve stem were broken or this wasn't passing air properly, you take that snap ring off, and then this valve assembly pulls out, and there's this valve here, and there's a valve seat and a spring. It's not complicated, but it's not easy to put back together again either. So unless you don't have to take this out, I would suggest leaving it where it is. Next, we pull the trigger straight out of the housing. Next, we have to take out the direction buttons because they're holding this valve in place. These pop out pretty easily. This one here is already broken, so that won't be a problem to take out. And the one that's not broken has to come out by depressing a retainer tab. And the retainer tab on this one is the thing that fell off. There should be a tab right there, but there's not. You can see it's kind of a worn down nub of what it used to be. That tab, it's supposed to be more substantial than that. And the way to get these out is just extend the button to its outermost position and then get in here with a pocket screwdriver and pry a little bit of pressure against the inside to clear that tab. The tab on this one is, well, it's there, but it's also worn down quite a bit. So one's broken already. This one's already worn down. I barely had to apply any pressure to get that out. So we'll just replace a pair of these anyway. And they come in a pair anyway, so he's going to get two new ones. And finally, we remove this valve in here. Now, the important thing to note about this is its orientation. This tab in the back has to face toward the rear of the housing. If it doesn't, when we put it back together again, then nothing's going to work. So this tab here, face it toward the back. This just pushes straight down through the handle and drops out the bottom. Last, there is this white gasket back here that just pulls straight out. And you just gotta get in there with a pick and hook it if you can, because it sets pretty flush. But if you can work an edge up and then just grab it through one of the holes, that's the best way to pull it out. There it is. And that's getting replaced anyway. So even if I hurt it on the way out, it's not a big deal because he's getting a new one of these. So normally the things that I would replace if something just has low power is this gasket, the gasket that goes between the rotor housing and the hammer housing, and the 6 rotor blades, because the surface of these get worn down too. And I'll check all the other gaskets and O-rings to see if there's any damage there, but that's the stuff that normally gets replaced. I don't see any additional damage here, but we're going to put it all through the parts washer, and then we'll give it one really good thorough inspection piece by piece. Now that everything has been put through the parts washer, we can get a good close look at the condition everything's in, because they're going to wipe it all down. As I'm doing that, I will inspect everything closely, and we'll see if there's anything that's been damaged or anything that needs to be replaced. Alright, here's something I noticed. The surface of the rotor is pretty rough. That is probably the biggest reason why this has low power. This should be nice and shiny and polished smooth, but it's gritty feeling. There's a texture to it. So that's burnt lubricant that has stuck to the surface of the rotor that did not come off during parts cleaning. So what I have to do here is dress the surface of this rotor using some fine sandpaper, some steel wool, and finally put it on the buffing wheel. So we'll put this aside because we'll tackle that after we're done inspecting all the rest of the parts. These shielded bearings are dirt cheap, so I'm going to replace it anyway. I have a stock of new ones. Between the cleaning this with solvent and running the risk of getting all the lubricant out of there, and the fact that it just has wear and tear on it over the years, I'm going to pitch this and just replace it with a brand new one. So all the parts that are getting replaced are the rotor housing gasket, this gasket, which is simply referred to as the gasket in the parts list, all 6 rotor blades or vanes, the rotor bearing, and a new pair of direction buttons. I'll put together my parts list. I'll show you how to dress the surface of the rotor, and we'll go from there. I'll be using different sandpaper. We'll start with 400 grit. I've got 1000 grit and 1200 grit. I also have some buffing wheels that I can use on my Dremel tool. And I also have a bench grinder with a buffing wheel. So no matter what, we're going to get the surface of this rotor all polished up and nice and smooth. We'll see which materials and techniques work best, but we'll start with the 400 grit. The 400 grit does a great job of taking off the old burnt lubricant. The surface feels pretty smooth, so we're well on our way. A few more rounds of this stuff, and then we'll move to finer grit, and I think we should be in really good shape. Although there is pitting on the surfaces here, it's not going to be a big deal or affect its functionality. So it's all polished up. I'm going to call this good, and we will wait for the new parts to arrive. All the new parts have arrived. We have the direction buttons, the gasket that goes between the hammer housing and the rotor housing, a set of 6 rotor blades, and the gasket. All the parts have been cleaned, inspected, laid out, and ready for reassembly. You can begin reassembling wherever you want, but the order does matter in how you put the individual assemblies together. And I find it easiest to start with the rotor assembly and putting the whole body back together again first. That way I can set that aside, then work on the hammer assembly and the other assemblies. So starting with the body, the first thing we want to do is put the valve back in, and remember what I said about the orientation of this, which is important. You want this tab here to face toward the rear of the unit, and it goes up through the handle. You just push it up. Now, because there's some O-rings on here, we're going to use a little bit of lubricant. And just push that up with something like a screwdriver or something with a long handle, and just set that in there so that that tab is facing rearward. And it's going to matter now. We have to insert the direction buttons. To do that, we have to make sure that when we're done, this tab is going to rest at 45 degrees of center with each push of the tab. So in order to put them in correctly first, I'm going to slide this valve over to start in its 45 degree position. Like so. And then insert one of the direction buttons. You can see on the buttons how these have a very substantial tab. That's what was worn off on the old ones. There you go, that's a good view of it. And these can only go in one way. Notice how the teeth on this are going to mesh with the teeth on the valve. And put a little bit of lubricant on here. And these just insert in the appropriate hole. There you go, and you just push them in place. You know you got this right when you push each button and you see that tab move equidistant on either side of center. See, the edge of the tab lines up with the edge of that square piece behind it. Now we know we're correct, and the new buttons are in place. Next, we're going to insert the white gasket that goes in the back. The gasket has a channel on it that slides in place and back here. It's difficult to see on camera, but if you were to do this yourself, you'd very quickly see where it has to go. It can only go in one way. And there it is. Now we'll put the air inlet assembly back. The first thing to do here is to put the spring clip back on it. And this has to be oriented correctly. The tabs on the clip have to be closest to the bottom, as opposed to having it backwards where the tabs go towards the top. So make sure that you have your tabs facing the bottom of the inlet, and it just snaps into place between these two pieces here, between the top there and the bottom there. And then this whole assembly just slides back into the handle. You might have to depress the tabs a little bit to get it to clear the handle, but there are two cutouts in the handle for the ears. So just know that you might get it caught up on something, not a big deal, and this can only go in one way. And there is an O-ring here, so we'll put a little bit of lube on that. And just be mindful of this washer here. I don't normally take it off because there's no reason to, but just make sure it doesn't get hung up by sliding up the inlet. Just leave it in its lowest position against the hex bolster there. And it clicks into place, and then the ears on the retainer tab just extend through the slots. Now the trigger goes back in. There is a small O-ring on the trigger, so that's going to get a dab of grease. You can see that there's a hook on the trigger here. When you insert that, that just latches onto the valve stem on the air inlet. You'll know you got it right when you insert this and then you can't pull it out. See, so it grabs that stem easily enough. And then you see it springs back once it catches. The body assembly is complete. Now we're going to do the rotor assembly. We'll take our nicely dressed rotor, and the first thing I do is put this back in the rotor sleeve so that you're not struggling putting the blades back in, and I'll show you why that is. So this just inserts through the back, and then you insert the bearing. That just slips in there nicely. While we have that out, we're going to lube that up, and we're going to pack it with grease. I hope they can hear me when this is
sorry.
done.
I'm almost done. Done.
And just get that packed nice and full of grease. And then the snap ring goes on the outside of that spindle. Make sure you take an extra second to be sure that ring is seated properly, and you can do that by seeing if you can rotate it easily around there. And if it doesn't, just press on it to make sure it slides into the slot so that it does slide easily around. See how that just spins freely? If that's not put in properly and it falls out later, then it's a world of hurt. So just take the extra time to be sure that's correct. So now the rotor is secure in the housing. And now we'll put a drop of air tool oil in each of these slots and insert the blades. I have seen videos of people reassembling these who say that you should use a lot of oil. I've seen people put engine oil in these things. My experience has been that you can over oil this, and I've been told that that doesn't matter because the oil will be displaced with the air going through there. But here's what I have seen. I have seen over lubrication of these where there was too much oil which prevented the rotor vanes from extending and doing their job. So I just put a drop in each and tell the customer to be sure that they regularly put a drop or two of oil in there. That way they're ensured of always being lubricated properly. Although these have a square notch in one end and an angle in the other, I'm not sure that the orientation of the rotor blades matter when you insert them, but I put them in the way they come out, and that is to put that notch toward the rear. And you just take these and slide them in. All right. Next is the cap, and this has to go on a particular way. There are grooves in there and a slot on the bottom, and that aligns with the bottom of the rotor housing where you have these two holes. And that just slides right on. And then this bearing just slips over the spline drive on the front of the rotor. And check its function again. That's spinning freely, just like it should. And then you take the speed switch, and there's an O-ring on there, so just put a little grease on it, and insert that in the back of the rotor assembly, and you'll know you got it right when that tab here fits in the center largest slot there. That just presses in, and then you can feel it turn back and forth. Now you take this entire assembly and insert it into the rotor housing, and that square tab on the bottom there that I used to align the valve with, that's gonna go through this slot in the bottom of the rotor sleeve. So just slide that in. And you got it right when the speed switch is flush with the rear. That's not going to protrude out. That is correct that way. That turns freely. Rotor assembly is complete. Next we do the hammer assembly. We're going to need the hammer cage and both hammers and the two hammer pins. And as we talked about before, when you reassemble these, the orientation of the hammers matter. Place one with the ghost hands facing up and the other with the ghost hands facing down. The other way to look at it is you have these two slots. You have a narrow slot on one end of the hammer and a wider slot on the other, and the same on the other hammer. Make sure that the narrow slot is lined up with the wider slot. And that'll also give you the ghosts in the proper orientation. So just place those one on top of the other and insert that into the hammer cage with these slots facing towards the sides of the cage. Then you take your pins and you just insert those, and those are going to slide past the slots that you lined up. The first one usually goes in pretty smooth. The second one, you might have to jiggle the hammers a little bit to get the slots to line up properly with the pin. Like that. And then those go in too. Don't turn this on end or the pins are going to fall out, so keep it horizontal like this. Now we lubricate the faces of the hammers and the sides of the hammer cage. Then we're going to insert the anvil into this assembly through the big hole in the front. This guy here, and just put a bunch of grease on the anvil and down to the hole there, because that's got to get lubed up pretty heavily. When you insert the anvil, you're going to have to jiggle it to get the dogs to slide past the hammers, and that just fits flush when it's complete. Take this assembly and just insert it in the hammer housing. And when the grease blobs out, to slide that all back in, make sure everything is lubricated really well in there. This is the new body gasket. When we took this apart, we noted that there is a tab right there. And we looked to see what we need to line that up with. There is nothing on the hammer housing like a slot that tab would fit into. So we're going to look at the body and see. Now, we know that this has to go one way over the other, because if you look real close, you can see that there's a shoulder on here. So there's a wider portion here and a narrower portion there. You can see how it's stepped. There's a good shot of it. And that step has to fit over the rotor housing, and that'll become obvious why, because this is also stepped. You can see the step right in there to accept that. So I'm going to assume that this is going to go with the tab facing down toward the trigger, and with the step portion mating with the body housing, or the rotor housing. And that seems to fit pretty nicely. Here is your opportunity to make sure you've got this cap lined up properly. You can see how there's slots in the cap that have to align with the holes in the gasket. That's to accept the body screws, and you put those through. So just make sure this guy's lined up properly and that all your holes are correct. If you had this cap upside down, your holes would not line up properly, and you'd be spinning your wheels wondering why you can get 3 body screws in, but the 4th one doesn't thread in. So that's a big gotcha on this one. Ask me how I know. So now you take the hammer housing and you have to align the holes in the hammer housing properly with the holes in the body. And you do that by looking to see which of these holes are closer together and which are wider apart, because these two are closer together than the bottom two. So you might have to play around with it. You might have to try to put the screws in. It's kind of tough to tell by looking. So just give it a shot and see. And if it doesn't work, try it a different way. Just when you put this together with the screws, don't force them. That way, if you're wrong, you can correct it easily enough. So just make the two surfaces and making sure that the splines mesh properly. And you can see how easy that is to fit in there, and the gasket closes that gap nicely. So now we're going to very gently put the body screws in and see if we got all the holes lined up right. The nozzle in my Loctite it's hardened in there, so I'm just going to dip this in there and put a little more than I like, but very slowly go through here to make sure you got the screws lined up. I think I got them. And if I can do the opposite corners, chances are pretty good I got all 4 of them lined up correctly. Okay, now that I started the screws, I didn't tighten those down. I have an adjustable clutch on this driver here. So I start at the lightest setting, and I will put these in sequentially and progressively. So I'll do like crossways to make sure that I'm compressing the gasket evenly. And then I increase the torque a little bit and do them again. And one more time at a stronger setting. And now we are reassembled, and check to make sure we get free movement of the anvil. We do. I got to put an air fitting there and take this out to the compressor in the garage and make sure that it works. Moment of truth. You can hear that this thing is screaming at optimal efficiency, so I'm pretty confident we got this right. I can't wait to get it back in the hands of my customer and have him give it a thorough test in real-world conditions. Thanks for watching. If you liked what you saw, please keep watching the channel because we have all kinds of new videos coming down the line, including more air tool repair videos like this one. We've got an Ingersoll 2235 Ti Max. It's going on the bench for a low power problem. Unlike the cause of this one, I think we're going to be surprised what we find with that. We also have our regular tools in the haul segments, but we also have our flyer drop video coming that's going to cover the end of 2023, and that's Q4 through October, November, and December. So do me a favor, click down here now to subscribe so that you don't miss any of it. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, use a tool. Don't be one.